The end began not with a whisper, but with a scream of iron and a sky stained black with the smoke of burning memories. For generations, the Empire had been the world, its laws as immutable as the seasons, its legions the pillars that held up the heavens. But pillars can crumble from within, eaten away by the slow, silent rot of decadence and discord. The great cities, once beacons of learning and order, now hummed with a frantic, feverish energy, the sound of a civilization sensing its own mortality. In the forums, philosophers debated emptiness, while in the palaces, emperors sold the very purple off their backs to pay for mercenaries who owed no allegiance to the eagle standard. This was the Golden Age's long, grotesque twilight, a period of profound unraveling where the intricate tapestry of law and lineage was pulled apart, thread by bloody thread. Then came the hammer. It fell from the frozen north, from the steppes beyond the known rivers, a tide of horsemen who seemed less like men and more like forces of nature. They did not build, they burned. They did not bargain, they took. Their arrival was a seismic shock, a violence so absolute and incomprehensible it shattered the very concept of reality for those who witnessed it. The legions, once the finest military machine ever crafted, were now hollowed-out shells, their formations breaking against the nomadic onslaught like waves against a cliff. The roads, those magnificent arteries of commerce and communication that had bound the empire together, now became the vectors of its demise, allowing the invaders to strike deep into the heartland with terrifying speed. The world, once so vast and ordered, suddenly felt very small and very, very fragile. In the wake of the collapse, a silence fell, a silence more terrifying than the cacophony of battle. It was the silence of abandoned fields, of empty cradles, of extinguished forges. The great aqueducts, marvels of engineering, stood as skeletal monuments against the sky, their life-giving waters dried up. The libraries, repositories of 1,000 years of knowledge, were now kindling for campfires, the wisdom of ages turning to ash in the mouths of illiterate soldiers. This was the true death not just of people, but of possibility. The complex systems of trade, law, and scholarship that had sustained the empire evaporated, leaving behind a collective amnesia. The art of writing was lost, the secrets of masonry forgotten, the very stars in the heavens becoming unfamiliar as the celestial charts were destroyed. From this silence rose a new, desperate sound, the scraping of wood and stone as communities fortified themselves into tiny, isolated pockets of survival. The grand, cosmopolitan identity of the empire shattered into 1,000 fragments. A man no longer considered himself a citizen of a great commonwealth, but merely a defender of his particular hill, his specific valley. Local strongmen, often the last surviving centurion or the most ruthless landowner, seized what power they could. They built wooden palisades on hills that had once held temples of marble, and their authority extended only as far as the reach of their warriors. This was the birth of a brutal, localized world, where the horizon was a threat and a stranger was an enemy. The common tongue splintered into dialects, then into new languages, deepening the isolation. Amidst the ruins, the human spirit faced its most elemental test. It was a return to a primal state, where the philosophies of the great thinkers provided no comfort against the gnawing of hunger or the fear of the dark. The old gods of the empire, who had failed to protect their people, were abandoned or transformed into vengeful, petty spirits. In their place, new beliefs crept in from the wilderness, animistic cults that saw spirits in every stream and tree, or harsh, dualistic religions that framed the world as a perpetual battle between light and darkness. The comfort of an afterlife became a desperate necessity when the present life was so cheap. This spiritual chaos was a reflection of the material world, a search for order, for meaning, for any explanation that could make sense of the unbearable collapse. Yet, in the deepest dark, the embers of the old world glowed. They were kept alive not in the halls of power, for there were none, but in the most unexpected places. In remote monasteries, tonsured monks huddled over parchment, meticulously copying not just scripture, but the surviving works of poets, scientists, and historians preserving a light they themselves barely understood. In secluded villages, old soldiers, their bodies scarred and broken, would tell tales of the empire to wide-eyed children, stories of cities of stone and laws that were written, not just dictated by the strongest sword. These were not mere nostalgia. They were a genetic memory of order, a dormant blueprint for a world that could be again. The past was not dead. It was a seed buried in the frozen earth, waiting for the thaw. And so, the long winter set in. Centuries would be measured not by the reigns of kings, but by the slow, painful struggle to simply survive. But the story of humanity is not one of perpetual darkness. It is the story of the stubborn, defiant will to rebuild. The chaos was not an end, but a brutal, necessary gestation. The monolithic order of the empire had been a beautiful, but brittle, vase. It had to shatter so that 1,000 new, more resilient vessels could be forged from its pieces. From the absolute zero of civilization, the only direction was up. The cracking of the world was the most painful birth cry imaginable, heralding the agonizing, glorious beginning of something entirely new. The land did not know silence for long. The vacuum left by a fallen Leviathan is never empty. It is filled by the scuttling of 1,000 smaller things, each carving out its own domain in the dust of the Colossus. This was the age of the splintered sword, a bitter, brutal epoch where the map of the world became a patchwork of bleeding, contested borders, drawn and redrawn by the whims of petty kings and battle lords. These were men who had seen the old grandeur fail, and in its place, they worshipped only the crude theology of the sharpened blade. Their kingdoms were not nations, but personal fiefdoms. Their laws were the caprices of their hunger, and their legacy was written in the ash of the villages they burned and the timber of the fortresses they built upon the bones of the old world. Consider the landscape of this broken time, where once a single road, patrolled by imperial legionaries, had meant safe passage for a merchant from one sea to another. Now, a traveler would cross a dozen frontiers in a day's journey, each one guarded by a surly, tax-hungry strongman in a wooden watchtower. The great imperial highways, those magnificent symbols of unity, were now sutures holding a corpse together, their cracked stones stained with the blood of ambushes. Every river ford was a toll station, every mountain pass a lair for bandits who were often the discarded soldiers of yesterday's failed warlord. The world had shrunk to the horizon, and that horizon was invariably topped with a palisade, behind which lurked a man who called himself a king, his crown forged from the melted-down jewelry of his victims. The psychology of these new rulers was a fascinating and terrifying study in paranoia and ambition. They were not born to throne rooms. They were men who had clawed their way to power from the mud and the blood of the chaos. A blacksmith's son with a talent for violence, a dispossessed noble with a remnant of loyalty, a tribal chieftain who saw the weakness of the plains dwellers. These were the architects of the new order. Their power was entirely personal, a fragile thing built on their own martial prowess and their ability to inspire fear and loyalty in equal measure. They slept with a dagger under their straw pillow, trusting no one, for they knew their own rise was the very blueprint for their fall. A king's court was often just his warband, drunk on stolen wine in a smoke-filled longhouse, their oaths lasting only until a stronger offer came from a rival. For the common people, the folk who worked the land, this was a perpetual nightmare. Their allegiance was a currency they were forced to spend anew with every changing season, as one warlord overthrew another. Their lives were a form of tax paid in grain, livestock, and sons. A good harvest was not a blessing but a curse, for it painted a target on their village for every marauding army within a week's march. They built their hovels in the shadow of the hilltop forts, not for protection, but for the dubious privilege of being the first to be consumed when the storm came. The old imperial peace, for all its faults, had been a known quantity. This was a world without predictability, where the only constant was the dread of the unknown, the rumor of horsemen on the road, the glow of a distant fire on the horizon at night. This fragmentation was not merely political. It was a cancer that ate into the very soul of culture. The shared stories that had once bound people together were forgotten, replaced by localized myths of origin that always served to glorify the current strongman. A craftsman who knew the secret of making a certain type of pottery or smelting a certain type of steel would guard that knowledge with his life, for it was the only leverage he had in a world without law. Marriages became tactical alliances between tiny domains. The exchange of a daughter a desperate gamble for a few months of security. It was a retreat into the tribal, a reversion to a mindset where the us was terrifyingly small and the them was everyone else. Yet, even in this morass of competing ambitions, the human yearning for order persisted. The most successful of these warlords, the ones whose names lasted more than a few years in the chronicles, were those who understood that fear alone was not a sustainable foundation. They began to borrow the ghost of the old world. They would appoint a scarred veteran who could still read a little Latin to keep a record of their law's crude edicts about theft and murder, but written down nonetheless. They would forge alliances with the remaining Christian clerics or pagan druids, lending a divine sanction to their bloody rule. They were, in their own brutal and imperfect way, groping in the dark for the tools of civilization, trying to build a wall that was more than just wood and spite. And so, the Age of Splintered Swords was not one of pure darkness, but of 1,000 flickering, isolated flames. Most sputtered and died, extinguished by a stronger neighbor or by their own internal rot. But a few, protected by geography, or by the cunning of their leader, or by sheer dumb luck, burned a little brighter, a little longer. They gathered more people, more craftsmen, more warriors. The constant, grinding warfare was a brutal evolutionary pressure, eliminating the weak and the foolish, and strengthening the resilient and the shrewd. It was from this cruel forge, from this bloody contest of 1,000 petty principalities, that one flame would finally find enough fuel to not just flicker, but to roar into an unquenchable fire. The stage was set not for a restorer, but for a creator. The chaos had done its work, breaking everything old so that something entirely new could be built from the pieces. They did not speak his name in the great halls, for he was of the wild places, a son of the granite hills and the whispering pines that had always stood beyond the reach of empire. While the petty kings in their wooden forts played at royalty, he was learning a sterner curriculum, taught by the bite of the winter wind and the cunning of the wolf. His childhood was not one of princely privilege, but of exile and survival. His family, minor nobility sworn to a lord long since betrayed and forgotten, had been scattered by the relentless tides of conflict, their holdings swallowed by the forest, their name all but erased. He grew up not with the weight of a crown upon his head, but with the heavy, gnawing knowledge of loss, a fire that would either consume him or temper him into something unbreakable. His youth was a tapestry woven with threads of hardship and revelation. He served as a hostage in the court of a rival chieftain, a common practice to ensure his remaining family's compliance. There, in the smoky, treacherous atmosphere of a lord who ruled by cruelty alone, he learned the intricate dances of politics and the hollow sound of false oaths. He saw how fear could command obedience, but never loyalty. He learned to watch, to listen, to hold his tongue while his mind raced. It was in this court of a splintered sword that he first understood the fundamental flaw of their age. These men fought only to possess, not to build. They sought to own the land, but had no concept of how to nurture it. This realization was the first spark of his great, unifying vision. His escape from that gilded cage was not a flight of glory, but a desperate, midnight scramble through muddy ditches and briar-choked woods, his body aching, his spirit burning with a newfound purpose. He did not return to a hero's welcome, but to nothing. He was a landless man, a nameless man, with no army but his own 2 hands and the fierce intelligence gleaming in his eyes. He took service as a mercenary, selling his sword to the highest bidder. But unlike others, he was not selling his mind. With every campaign, every skirmish, he was studying. He learned the art of war not from scrolls, but from the mud and blood of the battlefield. He saw how undisciplined rabble broke against a shield wall, how logistics won more battles than bravery, and how a commander who shared the hardships of his men could inspire a faith that no amount of gold could purchase. It was during a particularly brutal campaign for a minor lord, a man as foolish as he was ambitious, that the catalyst came. The lord, seeking a shortcut to victory, betrayed a sacred oath of sanctuary, slaughtering a rival family in a church. The act was not just a crime. It was a sacrilege that soured the morale of the entire warband and turned the local population against them. Our young commander saw the rot at the core of the cause he served. In that moment of profound disillusionment, as he looked upon the broken altars and the innocent dead, his personal ambition crystallized into a historic mission. It was no longer enough to simply survive or to serve the flawed powers of the day. He would have to become a power himself, one founded on a principle more durable than greed, the principle of order, grounded in a code that even kings must obey. He turned his back on the mercenary life, taking with him a small, hardened core of followers, men who had fought beside him and seen the quality of his character. They were not a great army, but a brotherhood. They retreated not to a fortress, but to the wilderness, to a hidden valley known only to the outlaws and the forgotten. This became their academy, their smithy. Here he began his true work. He drilled his men not just in the art of war, but in the discipline of it. He forged them into a single cohesive instrument, where every man knew his role and trusted his brother. He preached a new doctrine, that their strength would not lie in plunder, but in justice, that the land and its people were not spoils to be taken, but a trust to be guarded. He was forging not just an army, but the very soul of a future kingdom. The legends say that in that hidden valley, he underwent a final, symbolic transformation. He discarded the last trappings of his old allegiances, the faded insignia of the lords he had once served. He took for his banner not a beast of prey, but a symbol of resilience and unity, perhaps a great oak tree, its roots deep, its branches wide, representing a strength drawn from the land itself and a shelter offered to all who would swear to its protection. The boy who had been shaped by loss was gone. In his place stood a man of relentless will, his eyes holding the hard-won light of a grand design. The chaos of the age had been his anvil, betrayal his hammer, and a vision of a reunited world the fire that heated the steel. The forging was complete. Now the weapon was ready to be put to use. The scattered embers of the land were ready for a wind that would not extinguish them, but make them blaze. The storm was their herald, a great, brooding tempest that swept down from the mountains, tearing at the canopy of the ancient forest, as if the skies themselves were enraged by the audacity of the gathering. They came not as conquering heroes, but as shadows fleeing the light of a broken world, drawn to this hidden place by rumor and by hope, a hope that felt like a treason against the relentless despair of the age. There were less than 100 of them, assembled in a granite bowl beneath the weeping heavens. Hardened warriors with eyes haunted by countless betrayals. Hunters who knew the secrets of the silent forests. Dispossessed farmers whose hands were still calloused from plows they could no longer touch. And a handful of clerics, their faith a fragile flame guarded from the howling winds of disbelief. They stood in a circle around a single, rune-carved standing stone, a relic of a time even older than the fallen empire, and they waited for the man who had called them. He stood before them, the rain plastering his hair to his brow, his cloak sodden and heavy. There was no crown upon his head, no jeweled sword at his hip. His authority was etched into the lines of his face and carried in the unbreakable stillness of his posture. He did not shout to be heard over the gale. His voice was low, yet it carried to every soul present a clear, steady tone that cut through the chaos of the elements. He spoke not of gold or of lands to be plundered, but of a memory, the memory of a time when a man could walk a road without fear for his life, when a promise sworn was a bond stronger than iron, when the law was a shield for the weak, not a weapon for the strong. He gave them a vision, not of restoring the dead empire, but of building something new, something born of their own sweat and blood and honor, a kingdom that would be theirs and their children's, a legacy written in stone, not in sand. Then came the oath. It was not a complex litany of fealty, but a stark, brutal covenant that acknowledged the price they would pay. One by one they stepped forward, each man placing his hand upon the cold, wet stone. They swore not only to him, but to each other. They swore to be brothers in arms, to defend the man beside them as they would their own kin. They swore to uphold the law they would create, to be just in their dealings, and to show mercy where mercy was warranted. They swore to forsake the old petty loyalties of clan and blood feud, and to pledge themselves to this new abstract idea, a united land. But the most powerful part of the vow was the unspoken one, the understanding that this path led only to glory or to death, that there would be no retreat, no return to the fragmented, selfish lives they had known before. As the last man swore his oath, a strange quiet fell upon the clearing. The storm, as if having witnessed something it could not defy, began to abate. The furious rain softened to a drizzle, and a single shard of moonlight broke through the tumultuous clouds, illuminating the standing stone and the faces of the sworn brothers. In that moment, the broken circle was no longer broken. It was made whole, not by the perfection of its shape, but by the binding of its wills. They were no longer a collection of individuals. They were a single entity, a spark of concentrated order in an ocean of chaos. They had taken the most fragile thing in the world, a promise, and had decided to make it the foundation of their new world. The days that followed were a frenzy of purpose. The hidden valley transformed from a refuge into a mustering ground. The knowledge each man possessed became a resource for all. The warriors drilled with a new cohesion, their movements synchronized, their trust absolute. The hunters taught their craft, ensuring the group would never starve. The farmers, using skills long dormant, began to plot out terraces for crops. The clerics became the scribes and the moral core, recording the names of the sworn brothers and beginning to draft the first rudimentary codes of law. This was not merely an army preparing for war. It was the nucleus of a state, a tiny, functioning model of the kingdom they intended to build. They were practicing, on a small, perfect scale, the art of civilization. When the time came to move, it was not with the reckless charge of raiders, but with the deliberate, unstoppable advance of a tide. Their first objective was not a glorious battle against a mighty king, but the silent, systematic clearing of a forgotten fortress, a ruin perched on a crag that had once guarded a now deserted trade route. It was a symbolic act. They would not take a seat of power from another. They would reclaim one from the oblivion of the past, building their future literally upon the foundations of a fallen world. As they marched out from the valley, the moon-washed oathstone stood behind them, a silent witness to the moment a choice was made. A bond was forged, and the long, slow journey from chaos to order truly began. The ruins known as Raven's Crag were not a place of glory, but of ghosts. The wind whistled through the gaps in its tumble-down walls, and the only inhabitants were the birds that had given it its name and the thick, choking ivy that sought to pull the last of the stone back into the earth. To the warlords of the fertile valleys, it was a worthless place, a reminder of a failure they had no wish to emulate. But to the sworn brotherhood, it was perfect. It was a symbol, a blank slate. They would not occupy an existing stronghold, tainted by the memory of another's rule. They would build their own, imbuing every newly laid stone with their own purpose, their own law. The reclamation of Raven's Crag was their first declarative act to the world. We are not here to take what is yours. We are here to build what is ours. The work was backbreaking, a trial of muscle and will that tested the Brotherhood as fiercely as any battle. They labored not as lords and servants, but as equals. The leader himself, the man of relentless will, hauled stones alongside the lowest-born warrior, his hands bleeding, his tunic soaked with sweat. This was a profound part of his genius. He was not building a fortress, he was building a myth. The story spread, not of a mighty king in a palace, but of a chieftain who worked alongside his men, who shared their hardships and their rations. This act of shared labor was more powerful than any decree. It cemented the loyalty of his followers and began to draw others, not just warriors, but craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters who heard the tale and saw in it a reflection of the order they craved. The citadel rose slowly, its walls a testament to collective effort. Within these nascent walls, something even more revolutionary than stonework was taking shape. The birth of a legal code. In the long, fire-lit evenings, after the physical labor was done, the leader would gather with his clerics and his most trusted captains. They would not just discuss military strategy, they would debate law. What is a fair punishment for theft? How is land to be allotted and inherited? What are the rights of a freeman? What are the responsibilities of a lord? These conversations were the true laying of the foundation. The Code of the Crag, as it came to be known, was stark and simple, but it was written down. It established that justice was not the whim of the strongest, but a process, a thing that could be known and expected by all. It was the first glimmer of a system that would outlive any single man. The fortress became a magnet for the desperate and the hopeful. It was not just its growing walls that offered protection, but the promise of the law that resided within them. A peasant who had been robbed could come to the crag and have his case heard, and see the perpetrator judged not based on his wealth or lineage, but on the evidence. A merchant, wary of the dozen tolls on the road, could pay a single, fair tax to the brotherhood in exchange for safe passage along a route they now patrolled. This was the slow, patient work of statecraft, the weaving of trust between the rulers and the ruled. The brotherhood was transforming from a warband into a government, its authority deriving not just from the sharpness of its swords, but from the perceived fairness of its judgments. As the citadel grew, so did its shadow across the land. The petty kings in their wooden halls began to take notice. At first, they scoffed, seeing the effort at Raven's Crag as a fool's errand. But as its influence spread, their mockery turned to unease, and then to a cold, simmering fear. They understood instinctively that this new power was a threat unlike any other. It was not another warlord seeking to expand his territory. It was a competing idea. It offered their own people an alternative to the brutal, extractive rule they provided. A man who has tasted the promise of justice is far harder to rule through fear alone. The first stone of order had been laid, and its reverberations were beginning to crack the foundations of the old, splintered world. The citadel was finally completed, as winter began to loosen its grip. On the day the final gate was hung, a ceremony was held. No crown was presented, no royal title proclaimed. Instead, the leaders stood before his people, both the original sworn brotherhood and the hundreds who had since joined their cause. He held aloft a copy of the code, inscribed on a sheet of vellum. "This," he declared, his voice echoing off the new stone, "is the true ruler of this place. Not me, this law. We are all its servants." In that moment, the transition was complete. The fortress was no longer just a military stronghold. It was a capital. The man was no longer just a chieftain. He was a king in all but name. The first stone of order had been laid, and upon it, a kingdom was waiting to be built. The first challenge to the nascent kingdom at Raven's Crag came not from the settled valleys, but from the high, mist-shrouded peaks where the clan of the Grey Wolf held sway. They were a people untouched by the Empire's fall, because they had never acknowledged its rise. They lived by the old ways, their laws written in the cycles of the hunt and the raw justice of blood feud. Their chieftain, a mountain of a man named Kalen, viewed the stone fortress and its written codes not as progress, but as an insult to the untamed spirit of the land. When the envoys from the crag arrived, speaking of unified laws and mutual protection, Kalen laughed, a sound like grinding rock. He sent them back with a wolf pelt and a message. "The mountains do not bow to the valley. We are free." This was a crisis that could not be solved by sword alone. A direct assault into the treacherous highlands would be a bloody, likely disastrous affair. The leader understood that to conquer the Grey Wolf clan by force would be to destroy the very thing he needed: their fierce independence, their knowledge of the land, their strength. Instead, he embarked on a campaign of a different kind, a campaign of patience and respect. He did not send his army. He went himself, with only a small honor guard, into the heart of Kalen's domain. He entered their great longhouse, not as a supplicant, but as an equal, and he did not speak of submission. He spoke of a shared enemy, the chaos that starved all men, Highlander and Lowlander alike. He spoke of borders not as walls, but as seams, stitching the land together. For weeks, a delicate and tense dance ensued. The leader participated in their hunts, proving his mettle and earning a measure of grudging respect. He learned their customs, listened to their stories, and acknowledged their grievances against the valley dwellers who had always looked down upon them. He offered not dominion, but an alliance. The clans would keep their internal laws and their chieftains. They would govern themselves as they always had. But in matters of external defense and trade, they would be part of the wider kingdom. Their warriors would fight alongside his, not as subordinates, but as brothers in arms. Their voices would help shape the very laws of the land. He was offering them a seat at the table, a share in the dream, without asking them to renounce their soul. Kalen remained stubborn, his pride a fortress as formidable as Raven's Crag. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter, a brutal band of renegades from the lowlands, fleeing the justice of the new kingdom, sought refuge in the mountains, and raided a sacred Grey Wolf burial ground. The leader, upon hearing this, did not hesitate. He mobilized his own forces, not to attack the clan, but to assist them. He and Kalen fought side by side, hunting down the desecrators in a brutal, running battle through the crags. In the aftermath, standing amidst the returned totems of Kalen's ancestors, the two leaders faced each other. No words of treaty were spoken then. Only a slow, deliberate nod from Kalen, an acknowledgement of a debt and a recognition of a shared value. Honor. The pact was sealed not with a grand signing, but with a marriage. Kalen's daughter, a woman of the mountains with eyes like flint and a spirit as wild as the wind, was given not as a hostage, but as a bridge between two worlds. She married one of the leader's most trusted captains, a man who had earned her respect during the campaign. It was a union that symbolized the entire endeavor, the wild and the tamed, the old ways and the new, bound together not by conquest, but by choice and mutual need. The Grey Wolf clan did not kneel. They stood, and they joined. Their integration sent a shockwave through the region. If these, the most independent of all the peoples, had thrown their lot in with the kingdom at Raven's Crag, then its promise must be real. One by one, the other isolated clans and hill forts followed. Some were brought in by diplomacy, others by the demonstrated strength and fairness of the growing kingdom. The leader's realm was expanding, not as a blot of conquest on a map, but as a tapestry being woven, each new thread, each clan, each village, each valley adding its unique color and strength to the whole. The unification of the wild and the tamed was his masterstroke. It proved that his new order was not about homogenization, but about synthesis. It was about creating a kingdom strong enough to hold many peoples under one law, with room for all to breathe. The heartland was now secure. The kingdom was no longer an idea. It was a living, breathing, and growing reality. Just as the new kingdom began to feel the warmth of its own creation, a cold wind blew from the sea. They came in sleek, dragon-proud ships, emerging from the autumn mists like phantoms. They were the Scar Things, a people from beyond the known waters, and they were not like the petty warlords or the proud mountain clans. They were a scourge. They fought with a frenzied, ecstatic fury, believing that death in battle was a passport to their god's hall. They sought not land, nor rule, nor integration. They sought only destruction and plunder, the utter annihilation of anything they could not carry away. Their arrival was the test that prophecies had warned of, a force of pure, undiluted chaos against which the nascent order of the kingdom would either shatter or be tempered into steel. The first coastal villages were simply erased. There were no battles, only slaughter. The Scarthings moved with terrifying speed, striking and vanishing back into the sea mists before any force could be brought to bear. Panic, a contagion the kingdom had thought itself immune to, began to spread inland. In the great hall of Raven's Crag, the war council was divided. The old warriors, the ones who had fought in the Age of Splintered Swords, advocated for meeting the raiders head-on with brute force. But the leaders saw the futility of this. To chase the Scarthings was to chase the tide. They needed a new strategy, a new kind of warfare. The very structure of their society, their hard-won unity, would have to become their weapon. The response was twofold, a combination of defense and intelligence that showcased the kingdom's evolving sophistication. Along the coast, a system of beacon fires was established, a chain of light that could relay a warning of a raid deep inland in a matter of hours. But the true innovation was the creation of the first dedicated naval force. Using ships captured in initial skirmishes and built with knowledge gleaned from coastal fishermen and shipwrights, the kingdom built its own fleet. They were not meant to challenge the Scarthings in the open ocean, but to patrol the coastal waters, to act as a shield. This was a monumental effort, a diversion of vast resources. But the leader understood that to survive, they had to learn to fight on the enemy's terms. The defining moment came not in a great set-piece battle, but in a trapped estuary known as the Serpent's Maw. The kingdom's fledgling fleet, using its superior knowledge of the local tides and channels, lured a large Scarthing raiding party into the narrow waters. As the dragon ships pressed forward, they found their escape cut off by a boom of chained logs, and from the shrouded cliffs on either side, a storm of arrows fell upon them. It was a massacre. The Scarthing warriors, so invincible in their element, were trapped and cut down. Their leader, a giant of a man adorned with whalebone trophies, was captured alive. The victory was complete, but it was a sobering, brutal affair. The cost had been high. and the kingdom had been forced to mirror its enemy's ruthlessness to survive. The captured Scarthing chieftain was brought before the king in Raven's Crag. The whole expected a execution, a bloody spectacle to celebrate their victory, but the king did something utterly unexpected. He unchained the giant, offered him a horn of mead, and through an interpreter asked him a simple question: why? The ensuing conversation was a clash of worlds. The Scarthing spoke of a barren homeland, of gods who demanded sacrifice, of a culture that revered only the strength to take. The king spoke of building, of planting, of laws. He saw in the savage not a monster, but a product of a harsher reality. In a move that stunned his entire court, he offered the Scarthing chieftain and his remaining crew a choice: death or service. They could swear the oath and become part of the kingdom, using their strength to defend its shores. Some chose death, singing their death songs as they walked unflinching into the executioner's axe. But the chieftain and a core of his men, their worldview shattered by the mercy and the stark logic of their enemy, knelt. They took the oath. This act was the ultimate testament to the strength of the new order. It had not just defeated the Scourge, it had absorbed it, transforming a force of destruction into a force of protection. The former Scarthing chieftain, given command of the kingdom's coastal defenses, became one of its most ferocious and loyal guardians. The sun had endured the Scourge, and in doing so had proven that its light could not be extinguished, only reflected, and in that reflection, made brighter. The kingdom was no longer just surviving. It was evolving. With the Scourge from the sea broken and integrated, a profound silence settled over the land, not the silence of desolation that had followed the Empire's fall, but the deep, fertile quiet of peace. For the first time in living memory, farmers could harvest their fields without looking over their shoulders, and merchants' caravans could travel from the mountains to the coast without a military escort. This peace was the kingdom's greatest achievement, but it was also its next great challenge. The machine of war, which had forged their unity and defined their purpose, was now idling. The leader, the man of relentless will, stood at a crossroads. He had to transform a successful military coalition into a lasting civil institution. The warrior had to become an administrator, the war chief, a king. The ceremony was not held in a church, for the old gods and the new were still being reconciled across the land. It was held in the great square before Raven's Crag, under the vast open sky so that all could see. There was no pope or high priest to anoint him. Instead, the symbols of his authority were presented by the people he served. Kalen, the Grey Wolf chieftain, placed upon his shoulders a cloak woven from the wool of the highland sheep and lined with the fur of the mountain wolf, representing the wild. A guildmaster from the newly resettled lowland towns presented him with a hammer, its head forged from iron mined in the kingdom's hills, representing craft and commerce. And finally, the chief scribe, the keeper of the code, presented him with a simple, unadorned circlet of silver, mined and smithed within their borders. It was not a crown of conquest, but a crown of law and land. His first act as crowned king was not to declare a new war, but to formalize the great moot, a gathering of all the estates of the realm. This was the physical embodiment of his compact. Warriors, clan chiefs, guildmasters, farmers who owned their land, and even the senior scribes and clerics, all assembled in a vast field designated for this purpose. Here, laws were not simply decreed from the throne. They were proposed, debated, and consented to by the representatives of the people they would govern. The king held the executive power, the power to enforce, but the power to create law was shared. This system was messy, slow, and often contentious, but it was resilient. It made every segment of society a stakeholder in the kingdom's success. The next great work was the Doomsday Book, a great census and survey of the entire kingdom. For a year, royal officials traveled to every village, every hamlet, every estate. They recorded who owned what land, how many sheep grazed on the hills, how many mills stood on the rivers, what the productive capacity of each holding was. This was not merely an exercise in accounting. It was the foundation of a civil state. For the first time, taxation could be fair and systematic, based on actual wealth rather than the arbitrary demands of a strong man. It allowed for the planning of infrastructure, roads, bridges, granaries. It turned the abstract concept of a kingdom into a measurable, manageable entity. Knowledge, once again, was proving to be a more powerful tool than the sword. With peace and bureaucracy, however, came new forms of conflict. Old land disputes, frozen during the time of constant warfare, now thawed and flooded the newly established courts. Clan rivalries that had been subsumed by the greater struggle now re-emerged in petty squabbles over borders and water rights. The king spent as much time now hearing legal petitions as he once did planning campaigns. This was the tedious, unglamorous work of kingship, but he understood that every fair judgment, every peacefully resolved dispute, was a stone added to the foundation of order. The law was becoming a living presence in the land, a thing people relied upon as they relied upon the sun and the rain. By the time the first decade of his formal reign had passed, the transformation was complete. The boy forged in the wilderness had become the king who ruled from a hall of justice. The band of sworn brothers had become the nucleus of a sophisticated government. The Age of Splintered Swords was now a tale told to children by the fire, a nightmare from which the land had awoken. The kingdom was not a utopia. It had poverty, it had crime, it had injustice, but it now had the systems to address them. It had a common identity, a common law, and a common purpose. The crown, that simple circle of silver, was no longer just a symbol of the man who wore it. It was a symbol of the covenant between a people and their future, a promise that the long night of chaos was over and that the dawn of order had truly come to stay. In the quiet scriptorium of Raven's Crag, a young monk named Aiden dipped his quill into the inkwell, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Before him lay a vast parchment, its edges illuminated with intricate knotwork that intertwined beasts of the forest with symbols of the cross and the hammer. He was not copying scripture. He was writing the Historia Novi Regni, the history of the new kingdom. His task, assigned by the king himself, was to weave the raw, brutal events of the past 2 decades, the battles, the oaths, the laws into a single coherent narrative. This was not merely record-keeping. It was an act of creation as profound as the founding of the citadel. The king understood that a kingdom built only on law and land was vulnerable. It must also be built in the memory and the soul of its people. Aiden's chronicle was not a neutral account. It was a foundational myth, carefully crafted to serve the new order. The Age of Splintered Swords was portrayed not just as a time of war, but as a moral failure, a punishment for the hubris and decadence of the old empire. The king's rise was depicted not as mere ambition, but as a divine calling, his life marked by portents and his decisions guided by a higher wisdom. The Scarthing invasion was framed as a cosmological battle between the forces of order, the kingdom, and the forces of primal chaos, the raiders. Aiden was, in essence, creating the kingdom's Bible, a sacred text that would give its citizens a shared origin story, a shared identity, and a shared sense of destiny. This creation of official history was a powerful tool for unification, but it was not without its quiet casualties. The messy, complicated truths of the past were sanded down into smooth, moralistic parables. The king's early failures, his moments of doubt, the brutal compromises he had been forced to make, these were gently edited out of the official record. The complex motivations of those who had opposed him were reduced to simple villainy or folly. The clan of the Grey Wolf, for instance, was now remembered primarily for its eventual loyalty, not for its initial fierce resistance. The past was being systematically reshaped into a pedigree for the present, a process that required the silencing of alternative stories, the memories of the defeated and the displaced. The king, now growing older, would often visit the scriptorium. He would stand behind Aiden, looking over his shoulder at the elegant Latin characters, capturing a life that felt both distant and immediate. He never asked for changes, never demanded glorification. He understood the necessity of the myth Aiden was crafting. Yet, in those quiet moments, a profound melancholy would settle upon him. He was watching his own life being transformed into legend, his flesh and blood struggles being translated into the timeless, impersonal language of symbols. He was becoming a character in a story, and the man he had been was slowly receding, his complexities fading, to be replaced by the iconic image of the wise and just king. The dissemination of this new history became a primary mission. Scribes were trained to make copies, which were then sent to every major church and moot place in the kingdom. Traveling bards were encouraged to learn the tales and sing them in their own dialects, blending the official history with local poetic traditions. The story of the kingdom was becoming the national song. A child growing up in a coastal village and a child growing up in a highland steading would now learn the same basic story of their people, a story of chaos overcome by will, of oaths sworn in the wilderness, of a law that belonged to all. They were being taught to think of themselves as one people. The partnership between the scribe and the sword was now complete. The sword had conquered the land, but it was the scribe who conquered time. The kingdom now existed not just in the physical world of stone and soil, but in the intangible world of memory and story. It had achieved a form of immortality. Future generations would know the name of the king, the code of the crag, and the oath of the broken circle. The past had been organized, sanctified, and put to work in the service of the present. The chaotic, contradictory raw material of history had been refined into a clear, compelling narrative. The legend of a new kingdom, born from chaos, dedicated to order. The story was now as real as the walls that protected them. The king, who had once moved with the agile grace of a hunter, now walked the ramparts of Raven's Crag with a slow, measured step, the weight of years and rule bowing his shoulders. The crown, that simple band of silver, felt heavier now than any helmet he had ever worn. The great triumphs were behind him: the unification, the defeat of the Scarthings, the establishment of the law. Now his reign was defined by a more subtle, more insidious enemy: the relentless, grinding burden of governance. Every day brought a fresh pile of scrolls, petitions from a farmer wronged by his lord, reports of a bridge in disrepair, disputes over trade tariffs between the coast and the highlands, appeals for mercy from condemned criminals. The war for survival was over. The war against entropy had begun. His own family, the people who should have been his refuge, became another front in this silent war. His son and heir, Eric, was a young man of a different world. He had not been forged in the wilderness or sworn an oath in the rain. He had been raised in a stone fortress, tutored by scribes, his future kingship a given. He saw his father's methods as cautious, even weak. He chafed at the slow deliberations of the Great Moot, arguing that a king should lead by bold decree, not by consensus. He surrounded himself with young, ambitious nobles who spoke of expanding the kingdom's borders, of launching great projects that would stamp his name on the land forever. The king looked at his son and saw not a successor, but the ghost of the arrogant warlords he had spent his life defeating. The tension came to a head over the eastern marches, a region of sparse hills and independent-minded sheep herders who had only recently accepted the king's law. A local lord, one of Eric's companions, provoked a conflict by seizing a traditional grazing ground for his own use. The herders, in response, rose in rebellion, burning the lord's outpost and killing several of his men. Eric and his faction demanded a punitive expedition, a swift, brutal show of force to terrify the region back into submission. The king, however, refused. He saw the lord's greed as the true source of the conflict. He summoned the herders' elders to the crag, heard their grievances, and stripped the young lord of his title, awarding the grazing lands back to the community. Justice was done, but Eric saw only humiliation. "You rule like a merchant, not a king," Eric had shouted in the privacy of the royal chambers, his face flushed with anger. "You bargain and you appease. Where is the glory? Where is the fear that a king should command?" The king looked at his son, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He saw that the very peace he had built had created a generation that did not understand the price of it. They had inherited the order, but not the chaos that had necessitated it. They saw the crown as a privilege, not as a responsibility. This was the ultimate price of his success, the gulf of understanding between the builder and the inheritor. The king's health began to fail, an old wound from his mercenary days, a gash on his leg that had never properly healed, began to fester, sending waves of pain through his body and confining him to his chambers for days at a time. The business of the kingdom slowed to a crawl. In his absence, factions began to coalesce around Arik and around the older, more cautious advisors who upheld the king's original vision. The unity that had been the kingdom's greatest strength was showing its first cracks. The king, lying in his bed, was haunted not by the fear of death, but by the fear that everything he had built would not outlive him. He had defeated armies and united clans, but he could not pass on his own hard-won wisdom to his son. In a moment of clarity during a brief respite from the pain, he called for Aiden, the scribe. He dictated a new document, separate from the Grand Historia. He called it the Testamentum Regis, the King's Testament. It was not a law, but a letter, a personal, heartfelt plea to his son and to all future rulers. In it, he wrote of the oath of the broken circle, of the smell of the rain that night, of the trust in the eyes of the first 100 brothers. He wrote that the crown's purpose was not to glorify the one who wore it, but to serve the people who consented to wear it. He wrote that a king who rules by fear sows the wind, and his son will reap the whirlwind. He sealed it with his own signet ring and ordered it be read only upon his death. It was his final, desperate attempt to bridge the chasm, to pass the fire, not just the crown. As the king's strength waned, the great hall of Raven's Crag, once a place of open council and shared purpose, began to change. The air, once thick with wood smoke and the straightforward talk of warriors, now hummed with a new subtle music, the sound of whispered conversations in shadowed corners, of alliances formed with a glance, of ambitions masked by bowed heads and flattering words. The court was being born. The simplicity of the warband was giving way to the intricate, often toxic, ecosystem of a royal household. The focus shifted from external threats to internal positioning, from serving the kingdom to securing influence within it. Prince Eric was the sun around which these new planets orbited. Young, handsome, and impatient, he attracted those who saw in his ascension a chance for their own advancement. They were the new blood. Men like Lord Valerius, the disgraced Eastern Marches Lord's cousin, who argued for a more assertive, expansionist monarchy. They spoke of the king's old ways with a tone of polite condescension, suggesting that the kingdom had outgrown its founding principle, that it was time to trade the cumbersome great moot for the efficiency of royal command. Their vision was of a centralized, powerful state, where the king's will was the ultimate law, unencumbered by the tedious consent of farmers and clan chiefs. Arrayed against them were the Greybeards, the king's original companions from the Oath of the Broken Circle, men like Torvin, the master of the king's guard, whose loyalty was to the person of the king and the spirit of their original compact. They viewed the new blood with a mixture of contempt and alarm, seeing them as opportunistic courtiers who had not shed blood for the kingdom, only profited from it. They urged caution, continuity, and respect for the laws and institutions they had fought to create. Their power base was the army and the older, established clans who remembered the price of unity. Between these two poles, a third force quietly grew: the administrators. Led by the now-aged scribe Aiden, this group consisted of the clerks, the tax collectors, the judges, and the keepers of the Doomsday Book. Their loyalty was not to a person, nor to a romantic vision of the past, but to the state itself, to the cold, impartial machinery of government that ensured the roads were maintained, the granaries were full, and the laws were consistently applied. They saw both Eric's impulsiveness and the Greybeard's nostalgia as threats to the stable, predictable system they were building. They worked in the background, their power derived not from swords or lineage, but from their control of information and the treasury. The king, trapped in his chamber by pain, was aware of all of it. His spies, men and women who had been loyal to him for decades, brought him reports of the factionalism poisoning his court. He saw the danger. Eric, if unchecked, could become the very type of tyrant he had sworn to overthrow. The Greybeards, in their stubbornness, could stifle the kingdom's necessary evolution. The conflict came to a head over the question of the succession. The new blood began to openly advocate for the king to name Eric as regent, to hand over power before his death to ensure a smooth transition. The Greybeards vehemently opposed this, arguing the king should rule until his last breath. In a moment of supreme effort, the king had himself carried into the Great Hall. The court fell into a stunned silence at his gaunt, pale appearance. He did not address the factions directly. Instead, he announced the creation of a new council, the Council of the Realm. It would be comprised of 3 members: Prince Eric, to represent the crown; Torvin, to represent the army and the old guard; and Aiden, to represent the law and the administration. No major decision of state could be made without the consent of all 3. It was a masterpiece of political engineering. He had not chosen a side. He had forced the sides to balance each other. He had institutionalized the conflict, containing the chaos of the court within a structure of his own design. The whispers would continue, but now they would have to speak through the council. The king had won his last, and perhaps his most clever, battle. The king's final spring was a season of poignant contrast. Outside the walls of Raven's Crag, the world was explosively alive, meadows carpeted with flowers, orchards heavy with blossom, the air thrumming with the promise of new life. Inside the royal chamber, however, the air was still and heavy with the scent of medicinal herbs and the slow, labored sound of a breathing that would not last. The festering wound had claimed the king's leg, and the physician's saw had taken it, but the poison had spread. He was fading, a great oak slowly being hollowed from within. Yet his mind, that formidable instrument of will and vision, remained terrifyingly clear. His last campaign would not be fought with armies, but with the legacy of a lifetime. He summoned his son, Arik, not to the council chamber, but to his private room, where the window was open to the sounds and smells of the living world. The prince entered, his posture a mixture of defiance and a son's grief. He expected a final lecture, a reprimand, a list of instructions. Instead, the king gestured weakly to a chest at the foot of his bed. "Open it," he whispered. Inside, Arik found not crowns or treasures, but the artifacts of a life he had never known. His father's first, nicked and rusty sword from his mercenary days. The worn, water-stained map of the hidden valley where the oath was sworn. The simple wool tunic, still stained with mud and blood, that he had worn while hauling stones for the crag's foundation. "A king is not what he takes," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "A king is what he builds, and he builds not with this." He tapped his own temple, "but with these." He pointed a trembling finger at the relics in the chest. The strength of his arm, the sweat of his brow, the loyalty of his friends. "I am not giving you a kingdom, my son. I am giving you the trust of the people who built it with me. Do not break that trust. It is more fragile than any crown." For the first time, Arik looked not at a king, but at a man, a tired, broken, dying man who had sacrificed everything for an idea. The defiance in his eyes crumbled, replaced by a dawning, terrifying understanding of the weight he was about to inherit. Next, the king called for the members of the Council of the Realm individually. To Torvin he said, "Your oath was to me. When I am gone, your oath is to the law. Protect my son from his enemies, but more importantly, protect him from himself." To Aiden he gave a final, secret command, the testamentum. "Wait 1 year after my death. If he rules with wisdom, burn it. If he rules with pride, show it to him." Finally, he called for Kaelin's daughter, the wild mountain bride who was now a powerful duchess in her own right. He said to her, "Your people were the first to join us by choice, not by force. Remind your king of that, if he ever forgets." His final afternoon, he asked to be carried into the sunlight, into the courtyard where the great silver oak, planted on the day of his coronation, now offered a wide pool of shade. He sat there, his face turned to the sun, his hand resting on the rough bark of the tree. The court, the family, the captains, they all gathered at a respectful distance, watching in silence. There were no last words, no grand pronouncements. There was only a quiet man, a tree, and the Sunday. And as the light began to fade, his breathing slowed and then stopped. The relentless will had finally, peacefully been spent. The first king was dead. The news spread through the kingdom not by beacon fires, but by the sound of bells tolling in every church and the sight of messengers riding with black banners. In the villages, farmers stopped their work and bowed their heads. In the Highlandsteads, the Grey Wolf clan poured a libation of mead upon the earth. On the coasts, the former Scarthing chieftain, now a grizzled admiral, stood on the deck of his ship and faced the setting sun, singing the death song of a brother-in-arms. The kingdom, for a moment, was united not by law or by fear, but by a shared, profound sense of loss. The architect was gone. Now, the inhabitants were left to live in the house he had built. The crown felt cold on Eric's brow. The silver circlet, which he had once viewed as the symbol of his rightful power, now seemed like a band of ice, a constant, chilling reminder of the void his father had left. The great hall, which had once felt confining, now felt vast and empty, the eyes of the carved wooden kings on the beams seeming to watch his every move. His first council meeting as king was a lesson in humility. Where he had once expected quick deference, he found measured counsel. Where he had hoped for bold action, he was presented with complex problems that had no simple solutions. Torvin, Aiden, and the others treated him with respect, but it was the respect due to the office, not the man. He would have to earn the latter. His first test came from the north. A harsh winter had followed the old king's death, and the spring thaw revealed that the floodwaters had washed away a critical bridge on the main trade route to the highlands. The clan chiefs demanded it be rebuilt immediately, financed by the royal treasury. The lowland guilds, however, argued that the bridge's design had been flawed and that the Highlanders should share the cost. It was a classic dispute, the very type his father had excelled at resolving. The New Blood faction at court urged Eric to simply decree the solution, to impose his will. He felt the old impulse to do just that, to show his strength. But the memory of his father's final words echoed in his mind. He builds with the loyalty of his friends. Instead of issuing a decree, Eric did something unprecedented. He announced he would travel north to see the damage for himself. He journeyed for a week, not with a royal entourage, but with a small escort, and he visited not only the highland chiefs, but also the lowland merchants. He stood on the banks of the raging river, listening to the engineers explain the challenges. He sat in the smoky longhouses of the clans and in the counting houses of the guilds, and he listened. He did not just hear arguments, he heard fears and hopes and needs. Returning to Raven's Crag, he presented his decision to the council. The royal treasury would fund the majority of the bridge, acknowledging it as a vital artery for the whole kingdom. However, the Highland clans would provide the timber and the labor, and the lowland guilds would provide the skilled masons and a perpetual maintenance fund, secured by a small, agreed-upon toll. It was a compromise. It was not the glorious, unilateral act he had once dreamed of, but it was a solution that all parties, however grudgingly, could accept. It was, he realized, a better kind of strength. It was the strength that built rather than broke. In the months that followed, Eric began to change. He spent more time with Aiden in the archives, studying the Doomsday Book and the original Code of the Crag, understanding the logic behind the laws. He trained with Torvin in the yards, but their conversations now were less about tactics and more about the morale of the army, the welfare of the veterans. He found himself seeking the counsel of Kaelin's daughter, valuing her blunt, unvarnished perspective from the frontiers of the kingdom. He was, slowly and painstakingly, assembling the same toolkit his father had possessed, not through the trauma of exile, but through the deliberate application of duty. A year to the day after his father's death, Aiden the scribe came to him in his private study. He carried a sealed scroll. "Your father's testamentum," Aiden said quietly. "He commanded me to give it to you now, if you ruled with pride, or to burn it if you ruled with wisdom." Eric looked at the scroll, his heart pounding. He knew what it contained, a final lesson, a final judgment from the grave. He thought of the bridge, of the compromises, of the long, patient hours of listening. He looked at the old scribe and saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not judgment, but perhaps approval. "Burn it," Eric said, his voice firm. Aiden nodded, a slow, sad smile touching his lips, and without another word, he held the scroll to a candle flame and let it turn to ash. The heir had passed his final test. The king had come into his own. A generation of peace works a magic more profound than any spell. The children born after the Scarthing War did not learn the weight of a sword before they learned the weight of a plowshare. The roads, once patrolled by soldiers, were now busy with pilgrims, scholars, and merchants carrying spices from the south and amber from the north. Raven's Crag was no longer a lonely fortress on a crag. It was the heart of a thriving city, its original timber buildings now surrounded by districts of stone houses, its markets a babble of a dozen different tongues. The kingdom was prosperous, secure, and stable. But stability, while the goal of one generation, can become the cage of the next. New questions began to stir in the fertile soil of the peace the old king had planted. The most pressing of these was the question of faith. The kingdom was a tapestry of beliefs. The old nature cults of the Highlands, the warrior gods of the assimilated Scarthings, the stark dualism of the Easterners, and the growing influence of the Church of the White Christ, whose missionaries had arrived with southern merchants. The old king's policy had been one of pragmatic tolerance worship, who you will, so long as you obey the law. But as these faiths grew and established themselves, their competition for souls and influence began to create new tensions. A religious debate in a tavern could now escalate into a riot. The unity of the kingdom, once based on shared survival, was now being tested by divergent paths to salvation. Alongside this spiritual ferment came an intellectual awakening. The monastery schools, established to train clerks for the bureaucracy, began to produce a new class of educated men who were not content with simply copying old texts. They began to question them. They studied the fragments of imperial philosophy and science that had survived. And they asked new questions about the world, about the stars, about the human body. This new learning sometimes clashed with the teachings of the church and the traditional wisdom of the clans. A young scholar who argued the world was round could find himself in as much trouble as a heretic. The kingdom was facing a conflict between the order it had established and the restless, questioning spirit that order had inadvertently nurtured. King Arik, now a mature ruler in his own right, watched these developments with a complex mixture of pride and concern. He had maintained his father's kingdom, but he could feel the world changing beneath his feet. The Council of the Realm, so effective at managing the state's existing affairs, was ill-equipped to handle these new philosophical challenges. How does a law govern a man's soul? How does a king regulate an idea? Arik's own son, Leoric, was a product of this new age. He was more interested in geometry and astronomy than in swordcraft or law, and he openly questioned the need for the Great Moot, seeing it as a theater for squabbling interests rather than a tool for progress. The crisis arrived when a renowned philosopher from the south, a man named Alaric, arrived at court. He was a charismatic speaker who preached a doctrine of universal reason, arguing that the laws of men should be derived from the logical principles of the universe, not from tradition or divine revelation. His ideas electrified the young scholars and terrified the established religious leaders. The high priest of the old gods and the bishop of the new church, mortal enemies in all other things, came to Arik together and demanded that Alaric be expelled for sowing discord and blasphemy. It was the first time the two religious factions had ever agreed on anything. Arik was torn. Part of him agreed with the priests. Alaric's ideas were disruptive to the hard-won peace. But another part, the part that had grown into his kingship, remembered his father's warning about fearing new ideas. Instead of banishing Alaric, Arik did something that would have been unthinkable in his father's day. He organized a public debate. In the great square of Raven's Crag, before the entire city, Alaric the philosopher would debate the bishop and the high priest on the nature of law and faith. The kingdom would watch, and it would listen. Arik was betting that the strength of his kingdom was now robust enough to withstand a battle of ideas. He was planting a new seed for tomorrow, one that would grow in the light of reason, as well as the shadow of the law. The great debate in the square of Raven's Crag did not end in a clear victory for reason or faith. The philosopher Alaric eloquently argued for a law based on universal principles. The bishop spoke of divine grace and moral law, and the high priest invoked the ancient covenants between the people and the land. The people listened, argued amongst themselves, and went home with their beliefs challenged, confirmed, or simply confused. But something significant had happened. The conflict had been brought into the open air and contained within the arena of words. No riots ensued. No one was banished. King Arik's gamble had paid off. He had demonstrated that the kingdom's true strength no longer lay in its visible walls of stone, but in its unseen walls, the resilience of its institutions, and the maturity of its people to endure disagreement without fracturing. This resilience was soon tested by a threat far more mundane than philosophy, yet far more deadly: plague. It arrived on a merchant ship from the east, a silent passenger in the blood of a rat. It was a brutal, merciless disease that feasted on the crowded, bustling life of the city. The cobbled sword, they called it, for the way it bent its victims into agonized, rigid shapes. Panic, that ancient enemy of order, threatened to overwhelm the capital. People barricaded themselves in their homes, abandoned their sick relatives, and fled into the countryside, potentially carrying the pestilence with them. The familiar structures of daily life crumbled in the face of a microscopic foe. The response became the ultimate test of the kingdom's civil institutions. The Council of the Realm, acting on emergency powers, did not dissolve into squabbling. Aiden, now ancient but sharp of mind, coordinated the scribes and clerks to become a command center. Using the Doomsday Book records, they identified and isolated districts of the city. Torvin, his body old but his voice still commanding, deployed the army not as a weapon but as a humanitarian force, enforcing the quarantines, managing the distribution of food and water, and maintaining a grim necessary order. They established pest houses outside the walls, and though the measures were brutal, they were systematic and fair. King Eric did not flee to a safe country estate. He remained in the crag, a visible symbol of steadfastness. He walked the streets, his face covered with a scented cloth, visiting the quarantine stations and the mass graves, offering words of comfort to the dying and encouragement to the terrified living. He risked his own life, not for glory, but for duty. In doing so, he became more than an administrator. He became a father to his people in their darkest hour. The image of their king, sharing their peril, did more to maintain order than any decree. The unseen wall of his credibility held firm. The plague receded as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a city hollowed out by grief, but not broken. A quarter of the population was dead. The economy was in ruins. But the government still stood. The laws still functioned. In the aftermath, Eric and his council launched a great program of reconstruction. They used the royal treasury to rebuild, to offer loans to merchants, to support the orphans. The crisis had, perversely, strengthened the bond between the crown and the people. They had faced annihilation together, and their shared survival forged a new, deeper compact. The kingdom had proven it could withstand not only the sword of an enemy, but the scythe of fate. As the city healed, a new structure began to rise in the main square, not a fortress, not a palace, but a great library. It was King Eric's final great project. Conceived in the aftermath of the debate and the plague, it would be a house for all knowledge, the sacred texts of every faith, the philosophical arguments of men, like Alaric, the historical chronicles of Aidan, and the practical manuals of engineers and healers. It was the physical embodiment of the unseen walls. It declared that the kingdom's strength lay in its memory, its reason, and its ability to learn. The age of the sword was truly over. The age of the book had begun. The new kingdom had not just survived its trials. It had integrated them, becoming more complex, more resilient, and more alive than ever before. King Eric, who had entered his reign as a fiery youth and matured into a steady, thoughtful ruler, now found himself in the autumn of his life. The dark hair that had once been the pride of the court was now shot through with silver, and the battles he fought were waged with scroll and seal rather than sword and shield. His son, Leoric, was a man in his prime, a scholar, prince who had been weaned on the debates in the square and educated within the new great library. He was everything the new enlightened kingdom had hoped to produce: intelligent, curious, and deeply committed to the principles of reason and justice his grandfather had enshrined and his father had protected. Yet, as Eric looked at his heir, he felt a familiar, generational anxiety stirring. The mantle of kingship was a weight that could not be taught, only felt. Leoric's vision for the kingdom was one of perfect, rational order. He saw the Great Moot not as a vital, if messy, organ of consent, but as an inefficient anachronism. He saw the complex web of traditional clan rights and local customs as obstacles to a more uniform, and therefore more just, application of the law. He spoke of streamlining the government and rationalizing the tax code. His advisors were not warriors or clan chiefs, but philosophers and bureaucrats from the library. They drew up intricate plans for a new, ideal state, a kingdom run like a perfect machine. Eric listened to these plans and heard the echo of his own youthful impatience, now refined through the lens of logic rather than martial pride. The conflict between father and son crystallized around the forest laws. The great woodland that spanned the central heartlands of the kingdom was, by ancient custom, a common resource. The clans had rights to graze their pigs. The villagers had rights to collect firewood. The hunters had rights to track game. It was a complex, organic system of shared use that had evolved over centuries. Leoric, advised by his rationalists, saw only chaos and inefficiency. He proposed a new law that would enclose the forest, bringing it under direct royal control. It would be managed, scientifically, for timber production, and the common rights would be replaced with monetary compensation. It was, on paper, a more productive and manageable system. To Eric, it was a disaster in the making. He summoned Leoric to the royal map room. "You see lines on parchment," Eric said, his finger tracing the forest expanse on a large vellum map. "I see 1,000 ancient promises. You see inefficient use of resources. I see the loyalty of the men who live there. That forest is not just trees, my son, it is a contract. The one your grandfather made with the people when he asked them to swear his oath. If you break this contract for the sake of efficiency, you will gain a forest of timber and lose a forest of loyalty." Leoric argued back with calm, impeccable logic. "Loyalty cannot feed the people if the kingdom is poor. Sentiment cannot build the roads and schools we need. The law must progress, father. We cannot be chained to the customs of a darker age." It was the same argument Eric had once made to his own father. Hearing it now from his son, he understood the profound fear that had haunted the old king's final years. It was the fear that the future would inevitably misunderstand the past, that the vessel would be preserved while the wine within was spilled. Eric did not veto his son's plan. Instead, he did what his father had done for him. He created a learning experience. He sent Leoric, not with a royal entourage, but alone, to travel through the forest villages. He was to live with the people, to listen to them, to understand not just their economic needs, but their connection to the land. "Go and see the contract for yourself," Eric said. Not the words on the parchment, but the living thing. Leoric, confident in his reasoning, agreed. He left the capital a prince of the library, sure of his theories. The weight of the mantle was waiting for him in the quiet, dappled light of the ancient woods, and it was far heavier than he could possibly have imagined. Prince Leoric's journey into the heart of the kingdom began as an intellectual exercise. He carried with him scrolls of data, maps of proposed timber yields, and economic models for compensation. His first stops were polite, formal affairs. He would meet the village elders in their meeting halls and explain the benefits of the new forest law with clean, logical precision. He spoke of increased royal revenue that could fund hospitals and schools, of sustainable forestry practices that would preserve the wood for future generations. The elders listened politely, nodded, and offered him mead. They thanked him for his visit, but their eyes, old and deep as the woods themselves, held a reserve he could not penetrate. He was speaking a language of abstraction, and they lived in a world of concrete reality. Frustrated, Leoric left the villages and went directly into the forest with a group of the king's foresters. He wanted to see the inefficiency for himself. For days, they walked the hidden paths. He saw the commoners driving their swine into the clearings, the villagers carefully coppicing the hazel trees for wattles, the hunters following the subtle signs of the deer. He saw the charcoal burners at their smoky hearths and the beekeepers tending their skeps in the clearings. One evening, sitting by a campfire with an old huntsman, a man with a face like weathered oak, Leoric explained his plan for enclosure. The old man was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "The forest is not a thing, my lord," he said finally. "It is a relationship. You cannot buy a relationship. You can only break it." The truth of the man's words began to seep into Leoric's soul. He started to notice things he had missed before. The way a certain grove of oaks was never cut, because it was said to be the place where a local saint had prayed. The way the paths themselves seemed to follow not the shortest route, but the paths of ancient animal migrations and old storylines. He saw that the chaotic use of the forest was in fact a deeply complex and balanced system, a kind of unwritten law that had been negotiated between man and nature over centuries. His rational, centralized plan would not improve it. It would simply replace a living, breathing system with a dead, mechanical one. He was trying to fix a clock without understanding what time was. The climax of his journey came in a remote village that was celebrating its annual festival of the Green Man. Leoric, who had once viewed such pagan rites as superstitious nonsense, found himself swept up in the celebration. He saw the entire community, from the smallest child to the most ancient elder, participating in a ritual that bound them to the cycle of the seasons and the spirit of the place. It was not rational, but it was profoundly real. It was the source of the loyalty his father had spoken of. It was the living heart of the contract. Standing there in the firelight, surrounded by the singing, dancing villagers, Leoric felt the full, crushing weight of his error. He had confused the map for the territory. He returned to Ravenscrag a changed man. He went directly to his father in the council chamber, where Arik was in session with the Greybeards and the administrators. Leoric did not present a report. He told a story. He spoke of the old huntsman, of the Green Man Festival, of the living lore of the forest. He admitted that his plan, for all its logical elegance, was blind to the true nature of the kingdom it sought to govern. The law cannot just be rational, he concluded, his voice thick with emotion. It must also be rooted. It must respect the relationships that already exist, or it is not order but tyranny. King Arik listened, and a profound peace settled over his aged features. The circle was complete. The lesson had been passed down, not through a scroll or a testament, but through the direct experience of the land and its people. Leoric had not just learned about kingship, he had felt its true weight, the weight of 1,000,000 interconnected lives, traditions, and silent promises. The living had taught the prince what the law could not. The heir was ready. The kingdom's future was secure. Not in a perfect system, but in the wisdom of its rulers, to listen to the heart that beat beneath the soil of their realm. King Arik's passing was not like his father's, a dramatic end to an age of conquest, but a quiet closing of a long chapter of consolidation and peace. He died in his sleep, an old man content, his work done. The transfer of power to Leoric was seamless, a testament to the robust institutions they had built. There was no court intrigue, no struggle for succession. The Council of the Realm simply affirmed the new king, and the Great Mood acclaimed him. The kingdom had matured to the point where the office of the king was more important than the person who held it. The system, now, was the sovereign. Leoric's reign became the longest and most peaceful in the annals of the new kingdom. He became known as Leoric the Wise, not for launching grand projects or winning glorious wars, but for his profound understanding of a simple truth, that the primary duty of a king in times of peace is to be a gardener, not a smith. He tended to the kingdom, pruning where necessary, supporting growth where he could, but always respecting the deep, established roots of the society he governed. The ambitious forest law was shelved, replaced with a series of subtle reforms that worked with the traditional customs, making them more sustainable without destroying their soul. His great passion remained the Great Library, which under his patronage became the intellectual center of the known world. Scholars from distant lands traveled to Ravenscrag to study its collections. Here, the kingdom's own history, meticulously recorded by Aiden and his successors, was studied, debated, and refined. The Historia Novi Regna was no longer just a founding myth. It was a subject of scholarly inquiry. The messy human truths that Aiden had smoothed over were now being rediscovered by historians, who understood that the strength of the story was not in its perfection, but in its humanity. The kingdom was now secure enough to look at its own past with clear, critical eyes. This long peace allowed for a flourishing of art and culture that would have been unimaginable in the time of the first king. The epic poems of the founding era were set to music. The stark, functional architecture of the early fortresses gave way to beautiful, graceful cathedrals and public buildings that blended the styles of the highlands, the lowlands, and the influences from the south. A distinct national culture was emerging, one that was uniquely its own, a synthesis of all the peoples who had been woven into the tapestry of the realm. The kingdom was developing a soul, a personality that was reflected in its music, its art, and its literature. Leoric's final act as king was perhaps his wisest. Feeling his own strength waning, and with no son of his own, he turned the question of the succession over to the Great Moot and the Council of the Realm. He provided them with a list of potential candidates from within the royal family and the great noble houses, but he refused to name an heir himself. He believed that the next king should be chosen by the institutions of the kingdom, based on merit and the needs of the time, not merely by the accident of birth. It was the ultimate expression of his belief in the system over the individual. The kingdom was no longer a family business. It was a commonwealth. When Leoric the Wise finally passed, the kingdom mourned a good and prudent ruler, but there was no panic, no uncertainty about the future. The mechanisms he and his forebears had built smoothly engaged. The council deliberated, the moot debated, and a capable, well-respected cousin was chosen as the new monarch. The crown changed hands without a single sword being drawn. In that moment, the new kingdom achieved its ultimate victory. It had transcended its founders. It had become an entity that could live on its own, a self-perpetuating system of order, law, and culture that was capable of weathering the death of any king. The long reign was over, but the kingdom was eternal. Centuries have a way of softening edges, of turning struggle into story, and men into monuments. The new kingdom, now ancient itself, stood firm. Its borders had shifted, its dynasty had changed names several times, but the core of the law, the moot, the idea of a commonwealth had held. In the city that now sprawled around Raven's Crag, citizens went about their daily lives, largely unaware of the desperate oaths and bloody sacrifices that had purchased their mundane security. The crag itself was no longer the seat of government. A newer, more luxurious palace had been built in the plains, but was preserved as a national shrine, a place of memory. A schoolteacher, on a bright autumn day, led a line of children through the gates of the old fortress. They were on a field trip, a required lesson in their nation's history. They scampered across the worn flagstones of the courtyard, their laughter echoing where once the grim sounds of drilling soldiers had echoed. The teacher, a young woman filled with the modern knowledge of the great library, gathered them around the silver oak, now a giant, gnarled patriarch of a tree. She began to tell them the story. She spoke of the oath of the broken circle, of the code of the crag, of the first king and his relentless will. But the story she told was a polished gem, a series of clean, moral events. The children's eyes glazed over. It was just another old story, like the legends of dragons and giants. They could not feel the cold rain of that long-ago night, or the gnawing hunger of the famine winters, or the terrifying doubt in the hearts of the men who had gambled everything on an idea. They saw the stone walls, but they could not hear the whispers of the fear and the hope that were trapped within them. The past had become safe, sanitized, and ultimately distant. Later, in the Great Hall, now a museum, one small boy strayed from the group. He stopped before a display case. Inside, on a cushion of faded velvet, lay a simple, rust-pitted sword. The placard read, "The first king's blade from his days as a mercenary." The boy stared at it, his nose almost pressed against the glass. He didn't see a legendary artifact. He saw a piece of old, broken iron. But then he imagined it not in a glass case, but in the hand of a young, frightened man, fleeing through a dark forest, his future a terrifying blank. For a fleeting second, the centuries collapsed. The echo in the stone reached him. This is the perpetual challenge of order. The peace it creates inevitably breeds forgetfulness. The comfort it provides makes the struggles that won it seem like ancient, irrelevant history. The citizens of a mature kingdom risk becoming like the citizens of the late empire, complacent, entitled, unaware of the fragile human effort that maintains the walls against the ever-present chaos. They inherit the treasure, but forget the price. They live in the house, but no longer know the name of the architect, or the sweat and the hope that went into laying each stone. Yet, the potential for memory remains, buried like a seed in the human heart. It is sparked by a relic in a case, a line in an old poem, the texture of a standing stone in a forgotten forest. The past is not dead because it is past. It is merely sleeping, waiting for a curious boy, a questioning mind, a seeking soul to stumble upon it and for a moment bring it back to life. The kingdom endures not just through its laws and its armies, but through these moments of connection, when a citizen of the present suddenly feels the ghost of the past breathing down their neck, reminding them of the price that was paid for their world. From the cracking of a world to the quiet hum of a schoolroom, the journey is complete. We have witnessed the entire arc, from the absolute zero of civilization to the complex, thriving, and sometimes forgetful society that grew from its ashes. We have followed the man from the wilderness, the oath in the rain, the first stone of the citadel, the unification of the wild and the tamed, the scourge from the sea, and the long, patient work of building a crown of law. We have seen the weight of that crown pass from a father to a son, and from a son to a system. We have seen peace become prosperity, and prosperity breed new kinds of challenges of faith, of reason, of memory itself. This is not just the story of a kingdom. It is the story of us. It is the pattern of human history, repeated in 1,000 different times and places. The collapse into chaos, the slow, painful climb back towards order, the brilliance of the leaders who see the path, the sacrifices of the countless unnamed who walk it, the golden age of stability, and the eventual, gentle drift towards complacency. It is a cycle, But it is not a futile one. Each turn of the wheel leaves something behind: a law, a song, a memory, a lesson learned and recorded in the great library of human experience. Progress in history is not a straight line, but a spiral, where we encounter the same challenges again and again, but from a slightly higher vantage point, with the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors at our backs. The legacy of the first king, and of all who built the new kingdom, is not merely the land they unified or the laws they wrote. Their true legacy is the demonstration that chaos is not the natural state of humanity. Order is, but it is an order that must be chosen every day. It is chosen by the farmer who respects his neighbor's boundary stone, by the judge who upholds a law even when it is inconvenient, by the king who listens to the wisdom of the forest, by the teacher who tries to make a child understand the weight of a rusty sword. Order is a conscious act of will, a continuous rebellion against the entropy that pulls all things apart. So, as we look back from our own world, with its own splendors and its own anxieties, we can see the reflection of that ancient story in our own time. The walls we build may be of different materials, the laws we debate may be of different complexities, but the fundamental human drama remains the same. The endless, courageous, and often heartbreaking struggle to create light in the darkness, to find meaning in the chaos, to build a world where our children can dream safer, richer dreams than we did. The chronicle ends here. The specific story of this kingdom is told, but the echoes of its birth, its trials, and its triumphs reverberate through the corridors of time, reaching us even now. They are a whisper on the wind, a texture in the stone, a lesson waiting to be rediscovered. For the story of the past is never just about the past. It is a mirror held up to our present, and a lantern for our future. Because the past is never truly gone. It's waiting to be reborn.